Isaiah 40, verse 3. A voice cries in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord. Make straight in the desert places a highway for our God.
See if this thing works. It was a Monday in March, 41 years ago, Lubbock, Texas. I was home very sick with the flu. Very sick. I was in the 8th grade, Tim, in 1981. How's that make you feel? The only thing I really had to look forward to that day was the basketball championship, college basketball, between Bobby Knight's Indiana team and Dean Smith's North Carolina team that night. How fun was that? As I was coughing and feeling terrible, a sporting event that I really wanted to see was on that night. As I was laying in bed, I think I was on the couch in the living room, the news broke in that newly elected President Ronald Reagan had been shot, and it didn't look good for the president. I called my mother, told her the news at work, and she, not being a big fan of the president at the time, just started crying, and she said, "It's just like Kennedy." And those of you who were born on November 22nd, alive in November 22nd, 1963, know exactly where you were when you heard the news about Kennedy dying. And then, of course, we have 9/11. And I remember watching in Arlington, Texas, that second plane fly into the tower and say, "This is no accident." And our world has changed forever. It's chaos, disorder, uncertainty surround us. All of us have stories, don't we, of hurt, of sadness, of sickness, of sorrow, of shock, of surprise. Our world is full of disorder and unpredictability, and we live not knowing what tomorrow may bring. There's a cancer diagnosis, the death of a loved one, watching somebody suffer, a car wreck, lockdowns, crime. Having to hear Matt talk about the great ribeye he had. I mean, we all have these problems during our day, not to make light of those other things for sure, but it would be a mistake to say that because of these things, we have a God who is out of control or is not in control. Our God is very much in control of this world despite what goes on, or that He has no plan. He is not a victim of our decisions. Today we're going to look at a couple of verses. Our brother read for us the great Old Testament passage about John the Baptist preparing the way. Paul says this in Galatians 4, "But when the fullness of the time had come, God sent forth His Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who are under the law, that we might receive adoption as sons." Galatians 4:4-5. Our God is many things. He's a God of love. He's a God of mercy, of justice, of truth, of faithfulness, peace and patience. But impulsive or disorderly, He is not. He is a God of order. 1 Corinthians 14, verse 33. He is meticulous. He's faithful. He's creative. He is a thoughtful planner and designer. He does not change with the times. And hopefully in the next few minutes, we will show that He laid out a plan for our salvation in just a great way to prepare the way for His Son to enter the world. We don't want to minimize the last part of this verse about our adoption as children. We want to focus on as Ed would say, what in the cat hair did the fullness of time mean? What is Paul trying to figure out? Scholars have their opinions, Princeton. We're not really exactly sure, but I have a few ideas, and hopefully we can learn together about what the fullness of time meant as God prepared the way for his Son. Today, we consider 4 key elements that God put in place. You might see more, and if so, I'd love discussing this with you. Hopefully this material that we're going to go over will supplement what you have or will learn in class. It's by no means exhaustive, and it really serves as an introduction for further study. The first key element for you note takers. God had to prepare the minds of his chosen people, right? The Israelites. How did he do this? Well, starting with Abraham, God had intended to bless all nations through the Israelite people. He wanted his people to be the light to the nations, a city on a hill. He codified a covenant law for them that would serve as a beacon to those other nations. Officially with Moses, and for the next 1,200 years, God had tried to tell them, to instill in their hearts what it meant to be pure and holy and obedient and sacrificial and disciplined. The importance of parenting, how to eat, how to treat the oppressed and the poor and the widow and the orphan. My people, I need you to learn these things. This is who I am. For the Israelites, God was one and insisted they serve him only in a pagan, polytheistic culture. God also gave them his word, teaching them, and listen, teaching them through very real, historical, epic accounts of people who were flawed, yet did mighty things despite those flaws. Conquest, epic stories of adventure. Along the way, he mixed in great poetry with the wisdom literature, gave voice to the prophets, and gave us the greatest songbook ever written in the Psalms. Because of a very real sin problem that has existed since the garden, he gave them a very detailed system of how to deal with sin through the sacrificial system. It required strict submission and obedience that was to be faithfully followed. In many ways, this was the model for the cross, as the writer of Hebrews so beautifully lays out. And so in order to send Jesus in the fullness of time, in the fullness of the time, it seems right to me that he tried to impart some of his nature to his people. Just a glimpse into his nature, his requirements, his holiness, to prepare the way for Jesus. This was not a coincidence, in my view. I've heard this a lot. You may have too. For 400 years, we didn't hear from God. Right? We've heard that. And I guess it's because we think the only thing God can do or act or tell us about is we got to find in his Bible. Now, I believe that God has given us everything we need for salvation and for life in his word. But to say that God was silent after the last letter of Malachi was written, I think would be a mistake. I'm going to suggest that God was very active in the world. He needed to prepare the way during those 400 years for his Son and the Messiah. And how did he do this? Well, God had always wanted the Gentiles to come to salvation, right? This wasn't just an Israelite thing. God laid a careful plan with the Israelites first, but it was always his plan to bring in us, if you will. Genesis 12, verse 3, Genesis 22, verse 18, Isaiah 56, Isaiah 61 clearly demonstrate that the day is coming when the Gentiles will come to repentance. But how's God going to pull this off? The Israelites are the Israelites. They're over there. They do their thing. They've got their Hebrew Bible. How is God going to reach the Gentiles? Our God's really smart. I'm persuaded that he used the Greek and Roman law and their own prophets to do that. Beginning in 323 BC, Alexander the Great ruled the Mediterranean world. The Greeks were very religious, and they had a number of gods, obviously, yet they primarily focused on human reason for the first time in history, while the Jews focused on faith, leading some in the early church to say, Harry, what does Athens have to do with Jerusalem? In other words, why should the Christian be bothered with reading what the pagans wrote or thinking what the pagans thought? Why should I care about that? I'm going to focus on this. Well, I think there's very good reasons to know what the Greek and Romans thought. Paul did, didn't he? Just go read Acts 17. He quotes two of the Greek poets back to them about who God is. By the time of Jesus' birth, Greek ideas and Greek literature and Greek language were the norm when Jesus was born. We don't need to hear from you, Ron. I'm getting to you later, okay? The literate could read Greek. We'll say amen to that, Ron. Including Paul. He grew up in Tarsus. He knew Greek. He obviously knew Hebrew. He probably knew a little bit of Latin. He didn't just study the Torah. He also knew the Greek playwrights and their poetry. Probably went to a performance or two in the amphitheater. Paul was a Hebrew of Hebrews and a Pharisee's Pharisee, but he knew Greek and Roman culture as well. And I'm convinced that God chose him less because of his Jewishness and more because of his Greekness, his exposure to the Gentiles and knowledge of their culture and language and literature and myths and thinking. If you're trying to convert a bunch of Gentiles, who do you want? You want somebody who knows that stuff. Now, we've just discussed the Israelites. It was through the poetry of the Psalms and the prophets, as well as, think about the Old Testament. These are epic stories of journeys and conquests and failures and battles. And we've got prophets, and we've got poetry in the wisdom literature, preparing the hearts and the minds of the Israelites. Does it seem so unbelievable that God used the great poets, storytellers, and prophets of Greece and Rome to prepare the hearts of the Gentiles? I'm going to say, of course not. Perhaps through their own law and the prophets would he reach them. Let's look at two of these that maybe you'll find interesting. Again, this was not a coincidence in my view. Here are just some of the many poets. This is not Virgil Yoakum, but this is Virgil, the Roman poet who lived just before Jesus. Just before Jesus. And in his what's called the Eclogue, he says in this poem, a new birth has been given, justice returns, and a new progeny descends from heaven. By the way, this is a poem about a divine boy who will be born on earth, who will bring peace and order to the earth. And throughout the Middle Ages, Virgil's pre-Christian Isaiah-like poem was fully accepted by Christians as a pagan prophecy of Christ. Many accepted Virgil and others. There's numerous pagan prophecies. We likely would have had others had the library in Alexandria not burned. This was their scripture. This is what the Greeks believed in. How about this one? The story of Dionysus. Okay, just see if you see any similarities here, Darren. Dionysus was the son of a divine father and a mortal mother who was killed by the Titans because of jealousy and was raised to life again. He was resurrected. Okay? Now, if you're going to prepare the Gentile mind to accept the fact that, hey, Josh, I'm going to send my son, and he's going to live among you for a while, and he's going to die, and he's going to resurrect to life, okay? Wouldn't it make sense to kind of implant that seed into the Gentile mind before that day comes so it's not like a shock to them? Oh, yeah, that's possible. That could happen. That makes sense to me. Well, that's the story of Dionysus. And there's many others that we just don't have time to go over. Hopefully that whets your appetite for further study. Paul's speech, just go read Acts 17:28. For in him we live and move and have our being, as certain also of your own prophets have said. Paul is quoting Epimenides up there next to Virgil, the very first phrase from his poem. For in him we live and move and have our being. And Cleanthes, his poem, we are your offspring, O God. There's many others. C.S. Lewis was an atheist, and his understanding of Greek and Roman myth prevented him from accepting the gospel as true, because he told his buddy J.R.R. Tolkien, the author of The Lord of the Rings, he said, dude, they say dude in English? Dude, isn't the Jesus story just another one of your myths? Right? Isn't it just a big lie? And what would Tolkien say to that? He would say, no, they're not lies. He says, maybe this is a way to convey truths that would remain inexpressible. Sometimes myth is the best way of conveying truths. How about this? I can tell you all day long, I can preach from this pulpit and say, the law was made for man, not man for the law. You write that down, you take the notes. Okay, fine. But if I tell a story to illustrate that, like in Les Miserables, when Jean Valjean gets out of prison and he steals the priest's candlesticks and his silver, who's trying to help him, he escapes and is caught red-handed by the French police, and he drug him back to the priest. What does the priest do? He doesn't hide behind the law, does he? What does the priest do? Those of you who've seen or read Les Miserables, he lies to the police, and he says, oh yeah, I gave him those candlesticks. And in doing so, he probably saved his physical and spiritual life. And so that's a good way to tell that story. And that's what we see not only throughout the Old Testament, but also through Greek and Roman stories. And so this is really all C.S. Lewis needed. He said these ancient myths he loved were no longer a stumbling block to him. The culmination of Jesus, C.S. Lewis said, is the actual true story of what started by the pagans as good dreams. All these stories scattered throughout the pagan religions about a God who dies and comes to life again and by his death has somehow given life to us. No wonder the Gentiles were so receptive. This made sense to them. God chose to reveal himself to us through a sacred story that resembles more the imaginative works of epic poets and tragedians than rational philosophers and theologians. How cool is that? The fullness of time had come for the Gentiles. They were ready to accept the myth made fact. Up until the time of the Greeks, here's what idols look like. A bunch of wood. Some of them still today, even in India, right? You've got snakes and animal heads and whatever. Man-made idols. Starting with the Greeks and Romans, here's what the gods look like. They looked like us for the first time ever. I don't think that was a coincidence that God was trying to set the stage for a God who looked like us to come to earth. Our God's pretty smart, I think. You would have prepared the hearts and the minds. All right, Ron, Koine Greek, the third element, to the chagrin of our SIBI students. With Alexander, he brought culture, he brought literature, he brought a common language to the Mediterranean. If you're trying to spread the good news about Jesus, what do? Do you scatter the people with multiple languages, or do you set the stage by having a common language that that the literate could read, everybody could understand? And that's the language of the New Testament, is Koine Greek. And oh, by the way, what happened about a century before Jesus was born? The Greeks said, we think we want to translate the Hebrew Old Testament into this common language too, so that now the Greeks can read that as well. This was not a coincidence. And yeah, Saul of Tarsus was steeped in all of this. It's another reason God chose him. Fourth, the Pax Romana. To fully understand this, we need to go back to high school. We need to go back to our Shakespeare class that we thought was so boring. Remember Julius Caesar? Et tu, Brute, you too, Brutus. What's up, man? In 44 BC, the Roman Senate and his buddy Brutus kill Julius Caesar. He's assassinated. Afterwards, a triumvirate was formed. That's a three-person leadership team, which is never a good idea. You had a guy named Mark Antony, some guy named Lepidus, and Octavian ruled. About 12 seconds after that was formed, there was civil war, okay? And so Octavian became the leader. He kills, actual photo here, he kills Mark Antony and Cleopatra. Octavian takes over. And there was peace. Octavian was Caesar when Jesus was born. He ended a long line of wars. Now, you're not going to write all this down. This is a list of all the wars and battles and skirmishes and problems that there were for about 600 years before Jesus. Look at all this stuff. If it'll scroll for me. If not, can you scroll it for me back there? It's trying. Keep going. Keep going. Keep going. It's like 7 slides. Keep going. Keep going. So there was war, there were battles, there was piracy in the Mediterranean. The roads were terrible. You couldn't travel. It was dangerous. Keep going. One more. One more. Octavian takes over. And then look what happens when Augustus takes over. It's 905, but I'm almost done. There's not much happening between 11 BC and 43 AD. Well, what happened during that time? Jesus is born in the fullness of time. God said, I've got Israelites educated. I got the Greeks prepared for it. I've got a common language. And I'm going to raise up a Caesar who's going to bring peace to the entire Mediterranean world. Why is that important? So the gospel can spread. Here's what Caesar brought. He brought all this stuff. He paved all the roads. He educated the people. He brought clean water. He built all these aqueducts. He got rid of the pirates in the Mediterranean. He provided stability for people to travel freely. That's good news. This is the altar. to Augustine. And there's probably more than just these four. How about John the Baptist? How about bringing Jesus at a time when crucifixion was the norm? Our God is really, really good at planning our salvation and our redemption. When the fullness of time came, he sent his Son, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, that we might receive full rights as sons. In the fullness of time. What a great God we serve. Let's be encouraged today as we encourage each other about the salvation we have in Jesus.